thank you all for being here, first of all. This afternoon, we are joined by the esteemed Victor Luckerson. He is a journalist and author based in Washington, D.C. I discovered yesterday when we had dinner, my husband, he and his lovely girlfriend, Ariel. He works to bring neglected Black history to light. He is a former staff writer at The Ringer and business reporter for Time magazine. His writing and research have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Wired, and Smithsonian. He was nominated for a National Magazine Award for his reporting in Time on the 1923 Rosewood Massacre. He also manages an email newsletter about underexplored aspects of Black history called Run It Back. Definitely go check it out if you haven't, by the way. Winner of the Museum of African American History Boston and Nantucket Stone Book Award. His new book, Built from the Fire, that we're here to discuss this afternoon, tells a story behind Tulsa, a potent national symbol of success and solidarity, and weaves an epic tale about a neighborhood that refused more than once to be erased. So welcome, Victor.
Thank you, Shantaw, for having me. This is my first time in Nantucket ever, and I think I brought the good weather in with me, so really, really glad to be here.
You absolutely did, because you all told me that you arrived yesterday via a flight, and I wondered, how in the world did you get here? Because flights have been canceled for about 3 days, so you definitely brought it with you. Yeah. So thank you for that. We have you to thank for this lovely sunny day. So why don't we go ahead and start from the beginning, right? What first brought you to the story of Greenwood? Was there a particular moment or discovery that sparked the idea for Built from the Fire?
Sure. So I'm actually a business journalist by training. I worked for Time magazine in New York City for a few years, and then I was in Atlanta working for a media startup called The Ringer. So my day-to-day job was actually covering Apple, Google, Facebook, all those kind of companies, a million miles from Black history, to be honest with you. But it's always been a passion of mine. And when I was living in Atlanta one day, this is probably 2017, I guess, a high school friend of mine came to visit, and we ended up having lunch one day, and the film 12 Years a Slave came up. I don't know if anybody here has seen 12 Years a Slave.
Great film.
Yes. Well, my friend hadn't seen it, didn't want to see the movie, actually, because he was tired of only seeing Black folks being brutalized in all these historical depictions. If you think about the ways that Black people and Black history is often sort of taught or portrayed in Hollywood, we're very much sort of at the center of traumatic events often, right? It's either being whipped as slaves before the Civil War, sick by dogs during the Civil Rights Movement, and not too many other narratives. And so I asked my friend at that time, have you ever heard of Black Wall Street? That's an example of us being successful. My friend had never heard of it. So this is before the HBO shows about Greenwood, before President Trump visited Greenwood, President Biden visited. You know, it was still a relatively unknown story nationally at the time. My friend is actually himself a young Black entrepreneur. So in my head, I said, well, you know, why is this guy who's a young aspirational Black entrepreneur not know this story about Black business success? And that was the first thing that really kind of got my gears turning on the story. And believe it or not, if you Googled Black Wall Street in 2017, there were like 2 articles on the internet about it. And so, you know, I'm always somebody who wants to write about something that's a little bit less known. And so that really motivated me to want to dig into the story. And so I ended up visiting Greenwood for the first time about a year after that to sort of start digging into things. And what I found was deeper than I could have imagined, honestly. So.
And thank you for your willingness to take on such a difficult topic and part in our history. I think at this point, many people have heard about, or I hope at this point have heard about the Tulsa Race Massacre. But your book focuses on the larger arc of Greenwood before, during, and after 1921, long after 1921. Why, to you, was it important for you to tell the whole story and go beyond just the tragedy?
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to this convo I had with my friend and sort of, I think, what a lot of Black folks, and especially young Black folks, crave, which is stories that go beyond our trauma, you know? Even if you think about, I don't know if anybody watched the HBO Watchmen show in here, but HBO had a show that depicted the Tulsa Race Massacre in very, very vivid detail a few years ago. And so that was how a lot of folks sort of learned about this in the first place, this HBO show. But if you go back and watch it, you can look it up on YouTube if you want, but if you go back and watch this recreation of the massacre, it is very, very vicious and violent and in some ways accurate. But what I noticed when I watched it was that a lot of these Black folks who are getting shot on the street or dragged by car, you don't even see their faces, actually, in this depiction. And so often we sort of see Black trauma being dehumanized in that way. And I felt like if I wrote something that was only about the massacre itself, that would be dehumanizing in its own way, or perpetuating that. And so for me, it was really about sort of expanding on who these people were, both long before and long after that time. And so my book actually opens not in Greenwood, but actually in rural Mississippi with this family, the Goodwins. This is a family that was trying to find success in the Jim Crow South, weren't able to achieve all of their ambitions, and sort of decided to move to Oklahoma, seeking a better life for themselves, you know. So I write about how this man, J.H. Goodwin, was living in Water Valley, Mississippi, in a place where if you were a black man walking down the street and a white man came up to you, you're expected to scurry into the gutter. And so Greenwood and Oklahoma were sort of being billed as almost a utopia for black people. The Eden of the West is what it was called by some boosters. And so the Goodwins and many others sort of ventured from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, to Oklahoma and to Tulsa to find a better life for themselves. And so for me, you know, I wanted to spend a lot of time sort of celebrating what they had built before it was destroyed. And so when you dive into the book, you'll find so many stories of really interesting entrepreneurs. I got to talk about Lula now. I don't know if you got a Lula question, but I might get into it right now. Okay. So one of my favorite people to research in this book was a woman named Lula Williams. She was an entrepreneur in Greenwood in the 1910s and very much an advocate for herself. And so Lula owned both a confectionery and a movie theater on Greenwood Avenue called the Dreamland. And so in my research, I was sort of finding that though Lula was accomplished so much in her time, she didn't get a lot of credit for it initially. She had a husband named John who owned an auto shop, and he was very prominent as well. But in a lot of times, John was getting all the credit for what she did, both in the black and the white press, actually. And so I remember reading these articles in the press that said, John Williams, Negro Rockefeller, John Williams, best entrepreneur in Greenwood, and Lula's not even being mentioned in this business that she actually owns. And so, you know, a lot of what you do when you're a researcher like me is you're trying to look for compelling stories and mundane documents. And so I spent a lot of time looking through the property records of the Dreamland Theater, which Lula owned. And at one point I found this affidavit in the property records of the Dreamland that said, I, Lula Williams, own the Dreamland Theater. And she listed everything she owned. She said, I own the popcorn machine, I own the seats, I own the projector. John Williams doesn't own any of this stuff, it's mine.
Our girl was petty.
Yes.
She let y'all know.
And so, you know, that story is sort of captured in the book, and I think it was important because it showed, first of all, the fact that women like Lula were facing not only racism, but sexism in a lot of ways, but also all the different obstacles that people like her were able to overcome in Greenwood in those early days. And so, you know, the first, I guess, 100 pages of the book are really about what this place was like before it was destroyed.
I think you weave together the lives of multiple families over a century so well, and it reads both like history and narrative nonfiction. And I'm just wondering, so we chatted last night and you told me that you moved to Tulsa to do your research, and I can just imagine just the amount of information you found. How did you go about finding and piecing together these personal stories and choosing the characters, if you will, that you would focus the book on?
Yeah, so I think I had a few dynamics that I was trying to piece together. One was, I think, I wanted to explain how people survived all these different cross-currents they faced in Greenwood. It wasn't just the race massacre in 1921. Greenwood was destroyed by an interstate highway in the 1960s, like a lot of black neighborhoods around America. And today it's being gentrified. You know, there's a baseball stadium in the neighborhood and a lot of other things that aren't really for the black community. And so on my first trip to the neighborhood, I went on a reporting trip for an article initially. And so on my very first trip to the neighborhood, I met this woman named Regina Goodwin. She's a legislator in Greenwood. And we were there's a museum in the neighborhood, and she pointed this picture of her grandfather, this old black and white photo. He's in this haberdashery looking very well dressed and whatever. And she said, oh, this is my grandfather. You know, he owned a haberdashery store in Greenwood. And so it was kind of through Regina that I kind of realized that her and her family had a through line across the century, you know. So it was her great-grandfather who moved from Mississippi to live in the neighborhood. It was her grandfather who owned this haberdashery and then later a black newspaper, the Oklahoma Eagle. And it was her uncle, Jim, who still owns that paper today. And so if you go to Greenwood today, you'll see this old, it's actually a refurbished auto garage. It's now their newspaper office. But the Oklahoma Eagle is still there. And this family has owned some kind of business on Greenwood Avenue every single year since 1915. And so I think that made it almost obvious that they should be the through line for this kind of narrative. I kind of think there's kind of two different ways you can do a book like this. One is to interview, let's say, 100 different people until you find the perfect person for the story you want to tell. And the other way is to find out who's sort of gone through this and just tell their story whichever way it takes you. And so for me, it was sort of like I decided that the good ones were the family to focus on, and then I ended up being dragged. As I researched, I was pulled in a lot of different directions. I didn't expect to go with them, but I said, hey, if this is in the record, it's got to be in the book, you know? And so it was really, I think, rewarding to be able to develop such a close relationship with that family and many others, to be able to tell a story that I hope feels more authentic than some of the Black history narratives we get passed down to us through higher power sometimes.
And you absolutely did that, and we're going to touch on that a little bit later if I have enough time, because I have so many questions. But what were some of the most unexpected or moving discoveries you made while interviewing the descendants or digging through the archives?
Yeah, so I'll tell a couple, one tough and one fun, let's say. So on the tougher side, obviously the massacre itself was the hardest part of the book to write, both in terms of logistically. You know, this is an event in which a mob of up to 5,000 white people destroyed this neighborhood, destroyed thousands of structures, killed up to 300 people, and there are a lot of different competing perspectives on what happened, you know? And so just sort of being able to sort of piece together factually and historically what unfolded was really, really hard. But any harder than that, I think, was being able to capture the spirit of what happened in a way that I think both captured the brutality, but also didn't, again, sort of almost titillate the reader through violence. I think that's the real challenge you have in writing about Black history and Black trauma. I don't want the reader to be, even if it's subconscious, to sort of be getting something that you would get from an action movie from what I'm writing, you know, from all this violence. And so I actually ended up writing those chapters by hand. I probably written anything by hand since I was like 10 years old and writing my notebook as a kid. But I wrote those chapters by hand in a specific spot in the neighborhood called Standpipe Hill. So if you go to this place now, there's actually a tower for a college that's in the Greenwood now. But you can go on this hill today and you'll be able to see where the neighborhood was and imagine the businesses and the homes and the sort of grandeur they had. But also this hill is where, during the race massacre, the National Guard put a machine gun and shot down to the neighborhood and onto the residents. And so you kind of, in this one space, you can kind of see both the beauty and the tragedy of Greenwood's story. And so actually that's where I sat and sort of wrote by hand those chapters. And in terms of sort of a surprising discovery that was really tough to incorporate into that narrative, Red Cross reports were really helpful for me to figure out what was going on. The Red Cross was actually really helpful in the Greenwood recovery efforts. They sent in a lot of their workers and provided shelter, food, clothing for refugees, essentially, in Greenwood. And so they have all these reports to kind of capture what they did and all these statistics. So they're saying stats about number of homes built, number of meals served, et cetera. And also they had some stats about fatalities, you know, people killed, people injured. And so I remember one day I was in the library reading through this report, and in the fatalities list, and they had this information about stillborn babies. There were actually 8 stillborn babies lost during the race massacre. And so I remember when I sort of saw that information, it really sort of, you know, the flood of the emotion of the event kind of came to me all at once. And so that information is captured in the book, and I think that was one of those things that, you know, surprised me when I discovered it, but I knew it was really important to incorporate into the story. In terms of discoveries that were, you know, more exciting to uncover, this is more about me a little bit than the book itself, but so this Goodwin family, I mentioned this guy named Ed Goodwin who had this haberdashery that he owned in the 30s. And so he became this kind of the serial entrepreneur in the neighborhood of Greenwood. He owned this haberdashery, owned a newspaper. He was a lawyer one time, but also he was really involved in gambling, and especially this game called The Numbers or The Policy Wheel. Anybody ever played The Numbers or played The Policy Wheel? Anybody? Few of y'all? Okay, you can admit if you want to. So The Numbers was this game that was really, really popular in mid-century America, but it's kind of like the lottery, basically, you know? And so a lot of people, especially in Black communities, played The Numbers all the time. And this guy, Ed, even though he was sort of this upstanding civic leader of Greenwood, was also the numbers kingpin of the neighborhood. And so I would always call my mom with everything I was finding out in my research all the time. And so one day I called my mom and I said, Mom, I can't believe this guy, Ed Goodwin. I thought he was upstanding. I thought he was like well-to-do. He was gambling. He was bootlegging. He was doing all this stuff. Mom, don't you think that's crazy? And then my mom said, well, you know, your granddad was doing the same thing in Alabama, just so you know. And so that's how I found out that my grandfather also was a numbers kingpin of sorts. So that wasn't in the book itself, but that was a big discovery I made about my family. But I also think it was a good lesson just about, you know, how history really works and how, especially for Black folks in that era, If you were trying to move up the social ladder or the economic ladder, there wasn't going to be any kind of red carpet for you. No one's going to get you up there. You have to get there how you can, And so Ed Gilman got up here how he could. Sylvester Bender, my granddad, got there how he could. I think a lot of us have those kind of stories in our own families, So those are some of the things I discovered during the research that I think really, really stayed with me for sure.
It's funny because I can definitely speak to some family members that definitely played the numbers, and I grew up hearing about the numbers, even though I grew up in Jamaica. The section of the book where you talk about the stillborn babies, that also stuck with me. There's a quote that still just swims around in my head, and I'm probably going to butcher it a little bit, but I believe you wrote, "That night Greenwood lost its past and Greenwood lost its future," and that, it just keeps playing over and over in my head about that. And I texted him on Sunday, and I was like, "I'm so mad at you. I'm bawling my eyes out right now. I can't even handle it." The story of Greenwood is often described as one of both devastating loss and remarkable resilience. I'm wondering, how did you navigate telling both sides of the story without allowing one side to kind of overwhelm the other?
Yeah, so I'm I guess a journalist at heart. And so if I think for me it was almost like following the facts made that a lot easier. This book was a lot different than my original conception than it turned out. Like I said, this all started for me with my friend and sort of wanted to write something for him and people like him, people like us, that was sort of celebrating Black history and our accomplishments. And so in my head, I was almost going to write about this Black utopia of Black Wall Street and all the success people had. And so I remember when I first started the project, before I moved to Tulsa, I lived in Atlanta, and before my day job every day, I'd read the Black newspaper archives every morning before work for like 2 hours. And I remember I was reading these archives in 1910s Greenwood, and there were all these articles saying Greenwood doesn't have any lights, Greenwood doesn't have any plumbing, Greenwood has all these problems. And I was like, y'all are messing up my story right now, because I was trying to write about Black people succeeding and having a lot of money. Y'all talking about poverty and all that stuff I don't want to hear about, And so I had to kind of figure out how do I square that, And I think that challenge forced me to produce some more authentic work. And so ultimately the book becomes, yes, about some of these people like the Goodwins or Lula Williams who had a lot of success, but it's also about some of the challenges people faced in that neighborhood over time, and how a lot of times they were not getting the support they needed from the city of Tulsa or the state of Oklahoma. And so I think for me, being sort of forced to reckon with the record was really important, and it made me create more authentic work. I actually interviewed this other guy, Washington Rucker. He's a musician now. He's 89 years old. And so I interviewed him. He grew up in abject poverty in Greenwood, actually, in the 1930s and 40s. And one thing he said that stuck with me was, "Oh, that was never Black Wall Street to me. I don't identify with that phrase, that idea, because that was not what I experienced in this neighborhood." And so, his voice and many others in the book. And so it gives you, I think, a rounder perspective of this place. And again, kind of pushes back against the idea that Black people in any place can be defined by one perspective.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. That was going to be my next question, so I'll skip over it. Because So I learned about Greenwood in the throes of COVID, bored senseless at home. None of us could go anywhere. And I think something popped up on Instagram. And what stuck with me was Black Wall Street. And I was like, Black Wall Street, what is that? I've never heard anything about this. And I went down this rabbit hole trying to research Black Wall Street. But in reading your book, I felt like just that referring to it as Black Wall Street didn't really tell the full story of Greenwood. There are so many other lives and so many other people that were there that really were struggling, that, either the entrepreneurial bug or, just being Black in America in general, that just makes it, they say you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. It makes it difficult for them to even, turn $1 into 50 cents, type of thing. So
yeah, and I think for me, I think when you dig into that more, you get to find out some interesting, even economic dynamics when you sort of say, let's step away from the entrepreneurs and think about everybody else. So in fact, when you think about the most common jobs for Greenwood people, it wouldn't have been entrepreneurs or high rollers, let's say. It would have been day laborers and maids. And so a lot of women in Greenwood actually worked as maids in white Tulsa. Tulsa was actually the oil capital of the world at one point, so there was a lot of money sloshing through white Tulsa. And so a lot of times Black people worked in their homes and what have you. So these Black women were working in the white homes as maids, but they all got the same day off every Thursday, I think it was. It was called the Maid's Day Off. And so on Thursdays, all the women come back to Greenwood to shop. So if the women are out, the men got to be out too. And so Thursday actually became this huge economic driver every week in Greenwood, but it wasn't because of the entrepreneurs, it's because of the laborers, the maids and whatnot, who were really powering that economy. And so for me, it's important to kind of, even when we're talking about entrepreneurship economics, to show that how it was as much about the people who were spending as it was about the people who owned the businesses.
Thank you. As you wrote the book, issues of racial injustice, economic inequality, and generational wealth gaps remain very much alive. And I'm wondering, what lessons from Greenwood do you think are most relevant today?
That's a great question. I think, well, one thing I hope that people will take away from the book when they read it is, yeah, it's a story about Greenwood, but I think it's also the story of a city and a lot of American cities. And so, when you read this book, I would encourage people to think about or understand that no matter where you're from in America, somewhere in everybody had acts of racial violence happening around the same time of the race massacre. During the Red Summer of 1919, there were race riots or massacres in more than 50 cities across the United States. No matter where you're from, if it's a major city or even a smaller place, urban renewal and interstate highways really disrupted black communities and communities of color in the 60s and 70s. And I write in the book about how that played out in Greenwood, but also about, on a federal level, why that played out in Greenwood and elsewhere. And today, a lot of folks who are living in historically black communities are being priced out. That's going on in Greenwood. And so I think for me, just having that through line and being able to see how it relates to other cities is really, really important. I think the other thing I would say is Greenwood, the people in Greenwood obviously responded incredibly to a crisis. Their neighborhood was burned to the ground in a matter of hours. And, by Christmas of the same year, some of those buildings had been rebuilt. By 1925, the Negro Business League was actually hosting its annual national conference in Greenwood. So that rebuilding is amazing, and we celebrate that a lot. But something I think about is, again, going back to that first 100 pages of the book, all those bonds they built in their day-to-day lives first. One of the big challenges I think we have as a society that is in an ongoing political crisis is the fact that we often don't really have each other's backs until the crisis hits. And so I think it's actually really hard to have, assume someone's going to have your back or support you on the day of the crisis if you didn't even know your neighbor's name before that. And so this is a place where people really knew each other, loved each other, and cared for each other day to day before everything went south for them. And so I've really been thinking a lot about how we can build more third spaces outside of home or work where we can sort of be in community, and how we can sort of find opportunities to build bonds, again, that are separate from politics or from crisis. Because I think we can build those kind of bonds as Greenwood did. You're much more prepared to sort of band together when the crisis hits.
Exactly. I feel like even here on island, those of us who have lived here for most of our lives, we're almost seeing a little bit of our own community disappearing, in the sense that, you live in a neighborhood and it's constantly changing. It might be, I'll say it, a short-term rental next door, and it's just a constantly revolving door that you never get to know your neighbor anymore.
Oh, yeah. I wrote a huge critique of Airbnb when I was a tech reporter, but we won't get into that right now. So
fair enough. We'll talk. I'm curious, the question of reparations comes up often in discussions about Greenwood. How do the stories in your book inform the ways that we should think about reparations and repair?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I will say that, again, this is maybe the journalist in me, but when you read my book, you actually don't hear my opinion about reparations until the epilogue. I wanted people to be able to understand, A, the things that occurred in this community, but also how people there experienced them and felt about them without me sort of stepping in and saying, here's what I think about this big political issue. But I think when you read it, what you understand is that, A, the fact that the race massacre itself is a very clear and obvious wrong that has not been rectified. No one, again, there were more than 1,200 homes destroyed during the race massacre and more than 300 people killed. No one's ever gotten a dime for what they lost during that event. And it's incredibly well documented. Lula Williams, I mentioned earlier, who was such an amazing entrepreneur, her movie theater was burned to the ground as well as her confectionery. And I actually was able to uncover the lawsuit that she filed against the city of Tulsa and her insurance company. So Lula actually had a fire insurance policy on her buildings, so that if it was burned down, she would get a payout. However, in the sort of fine print of these contracts, the insurance company said that if it was destroyed in a, quote, riot, you get no payout. And so Lula never got a dime from the insurance company from the city of Tulsa. And actually, because of the stress of what occurred to her post-massacre, she actually died about 5 years afterwards, essentially from post-traumatic stress disorder. But I got the document that she filed with the lawsuit, and it actually lists out itemized everything she lost. So I gave the joke earlier about the projector, the screen, the seats, and it was funny in that context. But here, I got that through a lawsuit that she filed, where she didn't get any kind of money from any of those things that she lost. Lulu's family is still here. I work with them closely in a lot of my events. And I remember specifically when I sort of shared this lawsuit with her great-grandson, it hit him really hard emotionally. Like he knew obviously what happened. That story was known to him, but he had never seen the documentation, the thing that sort of said, this is what I am actually owed that I do not have. And so even I think that one small story with that one family, for me was really resonant, and there are thousands of families with those stories. And so I think in that case, to me at least, the argument for repair, let's say, this is not even exactly an argument for how do we calculate, on an abstract sense, this labor that might have been done. These are specific things that were destroyed. And we have the numbers, we have the dollars, we have the suits. And still nothing's been done tangibly for these people. And so I think for me, in this case of Greenwood, the argument for repair is very obvious because we have the dollars and the mechanics to do it right now. So,
what is Greenwood doing now?
So, my book covers, I moved to Tulsa in 2019. I actually moved the same time Lil Nas X dropped Old Town Road, if you remember that song. So the perfect time to go move out west. But part of what I did in the modern section of the book was sort of follow this pursuit of reparations or repair that's been going on in Greenwood for the last 5 to 6 years in particular. Y'all may have heard about the living survivors of the race massacre. There are 2 living survivors of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre. They're 110 years old. Leslie Bennyfield Randall and Viola Fletcher. I have the chance to meet both of them and interview them a few times. I remember when I met Miss Fletcher in particular the first time. I met her when she was 105. And I remember going to meet her, and I was so nervous that I was going to, blow her over somehow, And I remember, I was just being a little too ginger or whatever. She's like, I'm a real person. You can talk to me like a real person. It's fine, So she's very much with it and, energetic. And so these 2, along with her brother, Hughes Van Ellis, filed a lawsuit against the city of Tulsa in 2020. Seeking justice for themselves and for the other descendants of the race massacre. This lawsuit was kicking around through the courts for several years, and I remember going to the courthouse several times, and they would literally be there in their wheelchairs seeking justice. Ultimately, the lawsuit was dismissed by a Tulsa court and then by the state Supreme Court. It could go to the Supreme Court, but if it does, I think it's pretty obvious what would happen in that case. So the case is essentially dead. And one thing I will say about Greenwood and the people there is that when one door closes, they always open another one. And so this case was dismissed by the state Supreme Court last summer. In November, Tulsa elected its first ever black mayor. And this new mayor has been a big reparations advocate. And so actually just last week on the anniversary, 106th anniversary, 105th rather anniversary of the race massacre, he announced a plan to try to raise $100 million for reparations for Greenwood and these survivors. And so we're still sort of, waiting to see how much money can be raised. So I think the mechanics of all this are still TBD in some ways. But the last mayor of Tulsa said that he didn't believe in reparations because watching somebody living today pay for something from the past. And so we've come a long way, I think, from one mayor saying, even though the city of Tulsa was in some ways responsible for this event, we don't owe them anything, to have the next mayor saying, we're going to do everything in our power to raise this money for these survivors and descendants. And so, I think it's hard to, as a journalist, I have to be always a little bit skeptical of the details of these kinds of things. But ultimately, we do have a mayor now in power in Tulsa who is very much an advocate of the survivors and the descendants. And I think it's trying to do a lot to push this pursuit of justice forward in a positive way.
That's great. You write about trauma, and it seems like you write about trauma a lot. I wonder, especially as a Black journalist, this can take an immense toll on someone, emotional toll. Were there particular moments in your research or writing that were especially difficult or transformative for you?
Yeah, so there's this weird phenomenon, and I was at a school, and they gave me a word for it, and I can't remember the word. But I think the most powerful moments for me are when I'm sometimes when you're writing and researching history, there are moments you can kind of feel yourself connecting to the past in a really direct way. I had 2 moments like that working on this book. So the Goodwin family, Jim Goodwin owns a newspaper, the Oklahoma Eagle. He's 86 years old. And so I interviewed him 30, 40 times. But one day we were in his office. This is actually all in the prologue of the book. One day we were in his office, and I already talked to him a lot of times. He's like, oh, did I ever read you my Notre Dame essay about Greenwood? And I said, what Notre Dame essay about Greenwood? And so he like literally went into his desk and pulled out this like weathered paper that he had written in the 1960s when he was a college student. And so he had written about the race massacre in the 60s. And so he started reading it aloud to me. He's talking about the fire and the destruction and what had happened and how people had rebuilt from it. But for us to be sitting there in 2021 and he's reading a thing he wrote in 1960 and it's about 1921, time kind of collapses in those moments, you know. I had another moment like that. This is like almost at the very end of the research. One of the fun things about being a historian, researcher is sometimes you get these really amazing finds at the last minute. They're just like, oh man, I can't believe I found this. And so for me, I found an audio recording of the first ever ceremony commemorating the race massacre in Greenwood's history. No one talked about it publicly for 50 years, pretty much. But in 1971, at a black church in Greenwood, they had a ceremony finally acknowledging what had happened. And I got this audio recording of it at the last minute in the research. And so all these people who I had been researching for years, I got to hear their voices for the first time and really, have that human connection with them, which is really amazing. But also in this ceremony, they had a youth choir in Greenwood, and they sang "Lift Every Voice and Sing" the Black National Anthem. And so again, to be sort of here at the end of this journey I was on in 2022, hearing this youth choir singing in 1971, really about this thing they all suffered through 50 years before, it really connected me to all these people in a way that honestly made me wept in my office, just like processing all of that. And so I think for me, there were moments like that every once in a while where everything sort of almost time seemed to collapse in on itself, and I really felt the pull of the ancestors in a powerful way.
I can only imagine. What responsibility do you think storytellers like yourself have when writing about historical trauma, especially when communities have seen their stories erased or forgotten or distorted?
I think it's a huge responsibility, and I think there is a big risk among storytellers, artists, creatives, in maybe trying to absolve yourself from some of that responsibility, because you can say, well, I'm just a little writer, I'm not rich, whatever. But ultimately, journalism, let's take that, is a very extractive profession, I go into people's homes, they tell me their stories, and I produce it into something else for another audience. I think it's extractive by nature. And so if that's true, then my question is, what can I do to sort of counteract that, How can I do something that's additive and not extractive? And so, I had a few different things that I did in my process to try to rebalance the ledger a little bit. One thing is that my book has a lot of photos in it. There's probably 100 photos in the book. And whenever I could, instead of going to a museum to pay a license to use the photo, I went to these families. Because in a lot of cases, how did the museums get the photos? Well, somebody in this family 30 or 40 years ago gave them these photos for history's sake, and now the museum is getting a license fee every time someone uses them. So with Lulu Williams' family, actually, her son actually is one of the people who had a lot of the original photos of Greenwood pre-massacre. And so I actually paid her great-grandson the money for the photo instead of the museum. And so to me, that's a very small thing that, again, sort of re-empowers the people who are the holders of this story to understand that, they deserve to have some kind of recompense for what they've gathered and what they've experienced. So that was really important to me. And then another thing I really tried to do was try to help people expand their own understanding of their family stories whenever I could. So in the Goodwin family, I mentioned Jimmy was a newspaper, but there was also, he has a sister named Jean, who's kind of keeper of the family history. She lives in Nashville. And for years, for the first year I did the project, everybody said, Jean's never gonna talk to you. Jean's very private. Jean really cares about her family's history. She's not gonna talk to you. And so one day I wrote Jean a handwritten letter. I relearned cursive, had to figure that out again. I wrote her a handwritten letter talking about who I was and my intention with the book and trying to tell an authentic history. But I also was able to find documents she did not have. I had photos of her family she didn't have. I had articles about her grandmother found in the Greenwood's PTA. And so I basically helped her expand her own archive, And so now instead of it only being about me getting what I want from my book, it's also about what Jean is going to be able to have to expand her own family legacy. And so for me, it was just really important to find those kind of models to make sure that what I was doing, again, wasn't only taking, but also giving back in some kind of tangible way for these families I was working with.
and the care and attention that you gave to your book and to these people that were so brutally victimized and to their descendants is so obvious in the book, and I can say I very much appreciated that. I'm just wondering, because I just got the 10-minute marker. What's next for you? Are you going to continue to explore Greenwood and you know, any stories that you thought should be highlighted more, or are you looking to tell other stories?
Well, I'm still a freelance journalist, so I think especially with this reparations call that's been had, I'll be writing about that as more information comes out about that. Larger picture, I am working on new book projects and sort of exploring new topics. And I think what I'd say about that is, for me, it's really important to expand all of our understanding about the Black experience between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. I feel like when you're a kid, we're just off the page for a long time. You know, it's like the Civil War ends, and then Rosa Parks sits out on the bus. Like, what happened in the middle? That's 100 years. What was going on? And so I think filling in that huge gap in common American understanding about what Black folks were up to is really, really important. And I think this book filled in one gap. Tulsa Race and Massacre is about halfway between those two poles. I think there's a lot of other gaps in that time period, so I want to try to fill in more of those gaps as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Victor.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we have a few minutes, if you're okay, for some hands are
Sure.
already up. Would you like me to choose, or would you like to choose?
Oh, you can choose. Yeah.
Okay, all righty. I saw your hand first.
It's not so much a question as it is a comment. I would love to see someone cover the 1969 riots in York, PA, before everybody involved has passed. And I honestly think that it's getting, everyone's sort of hoping that it'll get forgotten. Well, all the white people are hoping it'll get forgotten. And I don't want to have it get forgotten.
Oh, I'm not that familiar with that event, but I'd love to talk to you about that after the talk.
I saw a play at Arena Stage this year that was about the Tulsa events. I think it was called The Standpipe or the Watchtower or something. It was referring to what you were mentioning. Are you familiar with that play, or did you help write it? I'm
not familiar with the play at all, but Standpipe Hill is one of the more famous, I guess, landmarks in the neighborhood. So.
Yeah, I think that's what it was called. But
okay.
Anyway, it was a good play.
By any chance, did your research, and I hope it did, uncover any acts of kindness extended to the people who were so brutalized during these events?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned, the Red Cross was really, really essential. And this man named Maurice Willows was the local Red Cross director. And so in many ways, he sort of became Greenwood's white advocate. And so he sort of was able to actually enter spaces in city council meetings, et cetera, sort of saying, we should funnel some of this money towards Greenwood rebuilding and not towards other projects. In particular, there was actually a plan in Tulsa right after the race massacre to buy a fleet of machine guns to bolster the police department instead of using the money for Greenwood aid. And Maurice Willows actually helped them reverse that decision. So there were, I think, some examples like that to some extent. But obviously, it was a situation in which Tulsa in general did not do what they should have, I think, for Greenwood's recovery.
Thank you so much. This was a beautiful conversation. I'm originally from Longview, Texas, which was a site of its own racial pogrom in the Red Summers. And then I happened to teach in Tulsa about 10 years ago at Gilcrease Elementary and lived on Greenwood and Archer. You know, one of the things I've been thinking about quite a bit is the kind of ceremonies fit for purpose. To really get at the kind of reparative work that needs to be done in communities, not just in Tulsa, but around the country. My question is, in a roundabout way, where did you see the strengths and limitations of the centennial commemorations of the last 5 years? particularly in Tulsa, but then around the country, as that work started, that, how would you say, kind of work toward Black collective memory was going on?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And again, kind of building off the idea of the role of storytellers or responsibility of storytellers, I think it's really important to think about that. And so in Tulsa's case, and a lot of this is sort of, I dive into a lot of it in the end of the book, Tulsa spent a lot of time and energy on ceremony. The 100-year anniversary of the race massacre was in 2021, and there was an expectation that it was going to be a big tourist and media event. You know, they kind of knew that. And so this new museum was built in the middle of Greenwood that opened in 2021, and they actually raised $30 million from corporate donors and nonprofits for this museum. It's very nice, it's very fancy. But a lot of Greenwood residents and people from that community didn't appreciate the fact that this money was being built for this museum while there should not have been money given towards restorative justice. And that became a huge, I think, sticking point in terms of the centennial. In terms of the positive things that came from all of that attention, I do think there is an effort, honestly, by more of the grassroots groups in Greenwood to reconnect the diaspora. And so every year on the anniversary of the race massacre now, there's an event that goes on where race massacre descendants can come together. Maybe people have never been to Greenwood before, their families were scattered to the winds, but they can come back to the neighborhood, meet other people from this community, and kind of try to rebuild those bonds, you know? So I talked a little bit about how they were such a tight community in Greenwood before the race massacre that was, you know, that helped them survive and recover. And so I think there's been an effort these days to sort of help those descendants to rebuild those bonds in a positive way. But that's been, for the most part, through grassroots efforts versus through the city of Tulsa.
I'm on the board of the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, and what you said at the end, toward the end of your talk, rings so true, that between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, there has been a blank. But in the last several years, people like you and others who wrote, for instance, about the Elaine, Arkansas race massacre, which nobody knew about. I grew up so close to there. And then the Tulsa one is another great example. Do you worry that this very unfortunate movement now of not teaching children in schools things that have happened that might make somebody feel bad is going to be bad for the fact that these things are now being uncovered and were being taught and were being brought to the surface? Does that concern you?
Yeah, it's a huge concern. I mean, I think it's very, very tangible, the impacts, you know. Among President Trump's many executive orders that have been passed this year, one of them in particular was about patriotic education. And so this order said that if you don't teach a patriotic history of America, quote unquote, you can have your funding pulled, your federal funding. And so what is patriotic history? Well, it's a story that America has always been striving and getting closer to its ideals at every step. I don't think you can look at 1921 and Tulsa Massacre and say that was an example of America getting closer to its ideals. You know, it was a reversal. It was a reversion. That happens sometimes in our country. And so I think when we ignore that, it's really, really dangerous. So I am really, really concerned about it. I know for me personally, you know, I go around talking about my work a lot, and it's harder now. A lot of schools have had their funding cut for funding speakers, for funding Black history in particular. So everything that's going on right now is very much tangible to the way that people are going to be learning history. But I guess what I would say, so everybody isn't just down in the dumps, is, you know, we have the ability to build our own networks in our own community. Greenwood had got nothing from the city of Tulsa, even before the race massacre. They didn't have governmental support, but they were still able to educate their children. They were still able to build a loving community. And so I think really finding ways and spaces to build our own networks is really, really important now. It's never been more important in my lifetime, but in earlier generations, they've had to do this before. And so I think I take, I guess, some inspiration from those Greenwood narratives because they show that you can build community, connection, and education, even if you have obstacles put in front of you from the highest seats of power.
Thank you.
I think that is all we have time for today. Thank you so much, Victor.